Well, good morning. I'm talking to you from Los Angeles, and it's 7 a.m. here. But I'm very pleased to be able to share some thoughts with you about first order and second order cybernetics. So my topic is detoxifying cybernetics from homeostasis to autopoiesis and beyond. So I'll start with a kind of mystery. By 1970 or so, most academic departments of cybernetics had disappeared, even though many of the ideas from cybernetics were still circulating in both in the culture and in scientific disciplines. So why? Why did they suddenly disappear? And I think there are various explanations for this, but one of them is the multidisciplinary nature of first order cybernetics, where it encompassed so many fields, it was difficult to integrate into academic structures that were based on separate disciplines. But I think another factor was the militarism and the black box psychology of first wave cybernetics. So to explore these ideas, I'll focus on the figure of Norbert Wiener, who loomed very large in the period from 1945 to 1960 or so. And I'll focus specifically on his work in World War II on an anti-aircraft predictor. And he built on his scientific research to expand his view to explain human behavior, as Peter Galison explains in his article, The Ontology of the Enemy, Norbert Wiener and the Cybernetic Vision. So Wiener postulated that there were two sorts of adversaries to scientific inquiry. One of them he called the Augustinian devil. And the Augustinian devil he equated with nature. Nature might resist your inquiries, but it did not try to deliberately trick you or mislead you. And that was in contrast to the Manichaean devil, which he associated with the adversaries of the US during World War II. These are adversaries that would use any kind of tactics, strategies, lies, deceptions to prevail in a conflict. So he was focusing then on this Manichaean enemy, and he pictured this enemy in servo-mechanical terms. So servo-mechanical mechanisms simply are actuators that incorporate feedback loops. And he envisioned a human, an anti-aircraft gunner, a calculator, and the weapon itself forged into a single integrated system. And in this integrated system, feedback mechanisms were crucial. So he realized that humans under stress tend to act repetitively and therefore predictably. And building on this assumption, he built a mechanism which would try to predict the evasive maneuvers of an enemy aircraft under fire. So to test this, he created two simulated lights on a wall, one for a dodging aircraft and the other for the gunner trying to shoot the aircraft down. And when he tested this against actual data where gunners were looking for enemy aircraft, the actual data showed that the predictor worked well for a single pilot under different circumstances. That is, let's say a single pilot making one or more runs, but not between pilots. Now, this was a very important realization, which he was not able to capitalize on at the time. Knowing what we know now with neural nets, if you knew that any enemy pilot tended to act predictably, you could use a neural net to build a mechanism that would reliably predict it. But with the technology he had at the time, he was not able to build a predictor that would work in all circumstances. So in that sense, his research was a failure. But in another sense, it forged an important bridge for him between humans and feedback mechanisms. So in an article that he published with Julian Bigelow, who was an electrical engineer, and Arturo Rosenbluth, who was a physiologist, he proposed that human behavior could be treated like a black box. So black boxes are units designed to perform a function without knowing what exactly was happening inside the box. And that was in contrast to white boxes that specified the inner mechanism. So he proposed that human behavior was a black box. And with colleagues like von Neumann and others, they formed a research group they called the Teleological Society that would treat human behavior in a purely behavioristic sense. And in this research group, mechanical engineering and neurology were seen as essentially the same field. So in the article that he co-published, he drew this conclusion, that human behavior is an act or behavior that may be interpreted as directed to the attainment of a goal. Hence, he was connecting purpose with teleology. A theology professor, Richard Taylor, objected that this definition of purpose was way too broad. So Taylor proposed a counterexample, a weighted roulette wheel. Was that purposeful? Taylor asked. And in response, Wiener and his colleagues made a distinction between passive devices and active devices. The anti-aircraft predictor used feedback, so it was an active device. The weighted roulette wheel was a passive device. And they reiterated their claim that as objects of scientific inquiry, and this is a direct quote, humans do not differ from machines. Therefore, human intentionality does not differ from machine self-regulation. This article marks the limits of first-order cybernetics. We can see what is achieved by this vision, but also what is obscured. So obviously, such a mechanistic interpretation of human behavior has many limitations and drawbacks. And as World War II faded into history, new visions began to emerge in the 1980s that tried to remedy some of these limitations. The period around 1979 to 1981 was particularly important. In von Forster's book, Observing Systems, published in 1981, he initiated what is now called second order cybernetics. So there's a pun in the title that the observer is observing a system, but the observer himself is also a system. And this kind of recursivity, cycling between the observer and what the observer sees, was typical of second order cybernetics, which emphasized recursivity, inclusion of the observer, and system environment couplings. So this now provides a basis for a bridge between some new ideas that were surfacing in the environmental realm and second order cybernetics. So in 1979, James Lovelock published his book, Gaia, A New Look at Life on Earth. And this marks the turn toward the environmental emphasis. So in Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, the Earth is seen as a self-regulating entity in which life forms and the environment are tightly coupled into a single feedback system. So in his book, Lovelock included a chapter on cybernetics where he focused on homeostasis, being able to maintain a stable state, which was important in first order cybernetics. And he argued that the Earth and all the biological life forms on it constitute a cybernetic system. So he had three principal examples to illustrate this idea. He pointed out that the Earth's atmosphere includes roughly 20% oxygen, that oxygen is a reactive gas. So therefore, Earth's atmosphere is a system far from equilibrium. What kept it from going toward equilibrium? And his argument was it was the action of biological organisms that maintained the stability of the atmosphere. A second example was the acidity or the alkalinity of the oceans. And he demonstrated by a series of calculations that the salt content of the oceans should be constantly increasing as water evaporated, the salt had nowhere to go, but instead the salt content remains approximately constant. And this could only happen, he argued, because of the action of organisms within the ocean. And then his third example was to note that in the 4 billion years since Earth was formed, the sun was constantly getting hotter. It was growing larger. But nevertheless, Earth systems showed a maintenance of a steady temperature, even though the sun was much hotter 4 million years later than it had been originally. And again, he attributed this tendency toward a steady temperature to biological organisms. And finally, to illustrate how organisms could stabilize a system, he created this simulation that he called Daisy World. Daisy World had black daisies and white daisies. So when the temperature was cool, the black daisies, which absorbed sunlight, proliferated and were predominant. When the temperature got hotter, white daisies, which reflected sunlight, began to take over. So in this simple simulation, he illustrated his ideas of how biological organisms react with the environment to create a homeostatic or a steady situation. So we're ready now to trace the transition from the military industrial emphasis of first wave cybernetics in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s to environmental concerns that began to appear in the 1980s and the 1990s. So the emphasis here turns from a human-machine fusion to a biota-environmental coupling. And this now makes cybernetics as characteristic of the living rather than predominantly about mechanical fusions. So now we introduce a new thread into this tapestry that we're weaving. Maturana and Francisco Varela's important book, Autopoiesis and Cognition, The Realization of the Living. And note the date here, again, 1980, right in that crucial period between the 70s and the 80s. And they define autopoiesis. Poiesis means to make. Poetry comes from the root poiesis. Autopoiesis means self-making or self-organizing. And they sketched out a feedback system in which the organization of an organism produces the components, but the components also produce the organization. So this kind of recursivity, they argued, was intrinsic to the process of living. And moreover, they wove cognition into this idea as well. This is a direct quote from their book. A cognitive system is a system whose organization defines a domain of interactions in which it can act with relevance to the maintenance of itself. And the process of cognition is the actual acting or behaving of this domain. Living systems are cognitive systems, and living as a process is a process of cognition. This statement is valid for all organisms with and without a nervous system. So essentially, in their view, they were arguing that cognition is coextensive with life. Now we'll begin to build out this environmental theme that is merging with cybernetics. So the next important event here is from Lynn Margulis, a microbiologist, in her 1970 book, The Origin of Eukaryotic Cells. So Margulis upended conventional ideas about evolution by arguing that the origin of eukaryotic cells came about because eukaryotic cells are simply cells that have a membrane and a nucleus. Karyotic cells are cells that do not have a nucleus. And those were the original living cells. But at the end of the Archean period, eukaryotic cells, cells with nucleus, began appearing, and that initiated a whole new chain in evolution. So she argued that eukaryotic cells came about because of the fusion of two previously independently living organisms, that the organism which became the cell absorbed another organism, which became the mitochondria within the cell. So the fusion came about because one cell was trying to ingest the other, but the ingestion was incomplete. And the ingested cell continued to live inside its host in a kind of symbiotic fusion. And then later, her theory was verified when it was determined that the mitochondria DNA were separate from the DNA of the nucleus, and that the mitochondria reproduced on a schedule different from the nucleus of the cell, thereby establishing that the mitochondria, in fact, had their own DNA and were previously independent organisms. So expanding on this idea, Margulis argued that bacteria are the only true individuals, that every larger organism, larger than bacteria, in fact, is a community of organisms. And of course, we see that with human beings because we have a whole microbiome inside a human organism, the gut bacteria, all kinds of other bacteria and viruses that live within our body. So Margulis argued that humans and every other mammal and every other macroorganism should be seen as a community, not as an individual. And moreover, she argued that evolution is driven primarily by symbiosis. And hence she argued for symbiosis, symbiogenesis. That is, that this symbiotic fusion was the primary driver of evolutionary change. Well, things really start to get interesting then when Margulis discovers Lovelock's work and begins to collaborate with Lovelock. And both of these major figures contributed something to the other's ideas. So Margulis expanded Lovelock's archive of biotic environmental coupling by contributing all the ways in which microorganisms couple with the environment to produce either new organisms or new kinds of situations. She argues, for example, that photosynthesis, the basis for all life on Earth, occurred through such an environmental coupling. And Lovelock, for his part, provided the basis for an expanded view of evolution. So Margulis always had a problem extending her arguments beyond microorganisms to macroorganisms. And even today, most biologists do not accept the idea that mammals, for example, evolved primarily through symbiosis. Rather, they fall back on the received ideas of natural selection and fitness criteria. So Margulis, I think, has won the day for microorganisms, but not for macroorganisms. So you can see how Lovelock now becomes important for Margulis's leap into macroorganisms. And we see this in her book, Microcosmos, 4 billion years of microbial evolution, published in 1989. So notice the time span here. We've gone from 1980 to almost 1990. And in those 10 years or 9 years, all this interpretation of environment-organism coupling has been expanded. So in 1989, here's what Margulis wrote about Lovelock. According to Lovelock's ideas, which he calls the Gaia hypothesis, the biota itself, which includes Homo sapiens, and you see there the leap to macroorganisms, is autopoietic. So now she's picking up on Maturana and Varela's idea of autopoiesis. It recognizes, regulates, and creates conditions necessary for its own continuing survival. So in the second edition of The Origin of Eukaryotic Cells in 1993, we find multiple references to Lovelock and to autopoiesis. And after that, Margulis typically refers to Earth or Gaia as an autopoietic system. There was a problem with the way that Maturana and Varela defined cognition. You recall that for them, cognition was coextensive with living systems. To live is to cognize. But by making it coextensive with living systems, the concept does not extend to non-living entities, such as, for example, computational media. So for this reason, machines fade from the picture in autopoietic discourse. That autopoietic Gaia focuses on the relation between biota and the environment. And at the same time, evolutionary explanations tend to split into symbiosis for microorganisms, natural selection and fitness for macroorganisms. But there is a brief essay that Dorion Sagan and Lynn Margulis published in 1985. It's only 7 pages long in kind of the successor to the Whole Earth catalog called the Whole Earth Review, which is not a scientific journal. And it's significant that Dorion Sagan's name comes first in this article. So Dorion Sagan is the son of Lynn Margulis and Carl Sagan. They divorced, but before they divorced, Lynn gave birth to a son, Dorion Sagan, and he becomes an important co-author for many of her later publications. But almost always in her scientific publications, she's listed as the first author, and Dorion Sagan is the second author. But in this essay, Dorion Sagan is the first author. And I think that's maybe significant, indicating that these ideas are really more his than Lynn Margulis's. So Dorion Sagan recognized that machines are not self-making or self-producing. They have to have people to produce them, maintain them, and so forth. So in the terminology of Maturana and Varela, they're not autopoietic, they're allopoietic. But, Sagan argued, they evolved by using autopoietic humans. So Bruce Clarke has emphasized the importance of this essay in a turn toward what he calls neocybernetics. So in neocybernetic systems theory, we get a combination of the thread we've been tracing through Maturana, Varela, Margulis, and so forth, and Lovelock, to cybernetic systems in Luhmann's social systems, with the hallmarks of second-order cybernetics: recursivity, reentry, the observer in the system and environmental coupling. And Bruce Clarke asks if all living organisms are also cognitive systems, could there be a planetary cognition? So you see, if you argue that the Earth is a single organism and all living organisms are cognitive, then you could hypothesize that there is something that we might refer to as planetary cognition. So now I'll turn to some of the fractures in these constellations that are building up, fractures that create problems because the ideas like Lynn Margulis's bacteria are imperfectly digested to form a really coherent constellation. So to begin tracing one of these fractures, I'll go back to Maturana and Varela. So part of their theory is that no information from the environment reaches the organism. Now, this is highly counterintuitive. You're listening to me talk, presumably you're thinking about what I'm saying. So it seems obvious that information is flowing from me to you. But in their view, they argued that environmental stimuli can only trigger an organism's responses, not cause it. And I believe that this can be traced to the fact that Maturana was a junior co-author on a very important biological paper, What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain. So the argument of that paper was that so much processing occurs in the frog's eye itself before it communicates anything to the brain, that the information coming from the environment is so hyper processed by the organism's own nervous system and way of processing information that it's not entirely accurate to say that the frog reacts to information. Rather, information impinges on the frog's sensory system and then is processed in a way specific to the frog. So Maturana argued that we cannot use causality when we talk about organisms and environments, and we have to instead assume this triggering, and that results in a very strained vocabulary because causality is built into our vocabulary from the ground up. And if you jettison vocabulary, if you jettison causality, you really have to go around the barn to get in the door. For example, when they talk about language, the primary mode of communicating information, they don't call it language, they call it languaging. We are languaging at present. And that's to remove the causal implication. Now, I think this part of Maturana and Varela's work is mistaken. I think I understand where it came from, but I think it would be more accurate and more sensible to say that information is transduced as it moves from the environment to the organism. I grant their point that it's completely transformed by the organism's own sensory system, but nevertheless, it is transduced there, and that removes the idea of some kind of absolute barrier between what's happening in the environment and what's happening in the organism. So you can see why I call this a fracture. If you're going to say there are feedback loops between the organism and the environment, and at the same time, you're saying no information can move from the environment to the organism, you have a problem. That's part of the undigested fractures in this emerging constellation. So I think if we go back to first wave cybernetics and say what made first wave cybernetics possible? Well, Otto Meyer has looked into this extensively in his book, The Origins of Feedback Control. And he goes back to the Greeks who knew self-regulating mechanisms, on water flow, for example, but now moving into the 19th century, thermostats, governors on steam engines. These sorts of feedback mechanisms were known since antiquity. What happened with cybernetics? Well, in the 20th century, there was a crucial new element added, the concept of information developed by Shannon Weaver and Norbert Wiener simultaneously. So as Otto Mayer points out, it was only in the 20th century that electrical self-regulation began to appear, and that became possible, a field of electrical engineering, which Shannon was located in, because of the development of a concept of information. So what's added to this ancient knowledge that makes first wave cybernetics possible is the concept of quantifiable information. Now, we've seen how cybernetics turn from mechanisms to organisms. And we've seen an early attempt by Dorion Sagan and Lynn Margulis to reintroduce machines. But to really reintroduce machines, we need to begin to heal some of those fractures that appeared. And a clue is offered by this emergence of the concept of information. So I think instead of making cognition coextensive with life, which kind of leaves machines out of the picture, we can begin with a definition of cognition that includes machines because it also includes information. So in my book, Unthought, I devised this definition for cognition. Cognition is the process of interpreting information in contexts that connect it with meaning. Now, this has something in common with Maturana and Varela's ideas. Like them, I see cognition as a process. And like them, I see that all biological organisms have cognitive capacities. But the difference is that this definition also allows computational media to have cognitive capacities as well, because computational media, like biological organisms, interpret information in contexts that connect them with meaning. So now we have a kind of integrated framework incorporating humans, living non-human organisms, and computational media. And I call these cognitive assemblages. So cognitive assemblages are collectivities, not exclusively human, not exclusively organic, through which information, interpretations, and meanings circulate. So in another way that my view departs from the constellation that we were tracing is the idea that Gaia could be a single organism. And of course, by adopting the name of a Greek goddess, Lovelock implied personhood for the planet. Personhood implies intentionality. Intentionality applies something like planetary cognition. And Margulis, with her background in biology, was skeptical of this idea. And she remained somewhat skeptical, although she began to use Gaia terminology. But if we focus on cognition in the way that I defined it, it allows us to make a clear distinction between agents and actors. So material processes like erosion, breakdown of rocks, so forth, have agency, but they do not perform interpretations or make selections and decisions. Actors, by contrast, do make decisions. So actors would include all organic, all biological organisms, as well as computational media. So now we have something that we can call, instead of symbiosis or symbiogenesis, techno-symbiosis. So it incorporates and extends biosymbiosis into the technical realm as well. So like that early essay of Sagan and Margulis, I would argue machines do evolve, and they evolve through incorporating humans into their collectivities. And this is mutually beneficial both to machines and humans. So it is a symbiosis. Humans have their cognitive capacity extended through cognitive machines. And of course, we know all about that. I can talk to you from Los Angeles to China precisely because I have a cognitive machine that I'm hooked up to. And we see biota and environmental couplings of the kind that Lovelock emphasized. But we also now have human and machine couplings, and environments are increasingly co-constructed. They include not only couplings between biota and the environment, but couplings between humans, computational media, and the environment. So this is what I mean by techno-symbiosis. Now, part of this argument is to say that machines have perceptions. Machines interpret information from their environment. So using the terminology of Jakob von Uexküll, I would say machines have Umwelten, or world horizons. Now, Uexküll argued that living organisms all have specific worldviews. The frog, for example, thinks and perceives like a frog, which is dramatically different than how a human perceives. But computational media also have inputs and outputs, and even standalone computers have a vision of the world that they construct through their relatively narrow and deterministic inputs. But once we begin to move into computational networks that have sensors and actuators, then it becomes even clearer that they perceive the world through their sensors and they act on the world through their actuators. So they have their own Umwelten, or world horizons, which are distinctive to them, always different from humans, although overlapping with humans in ways that allow us to form techno-symbiosis. So could we be talking now about a third wave of cybernetics, or third order cybernetics, that includes insights from first order cybernetics, mechanistic couplings of the kind Wiener talked about, second order cybernetics that include Maturana and Varela, as well as Margulis and Lovelock. So it includes the observer and the system dynamics, but also system and environment dynamics. But now it adds the co-evolution of humans and machines in an integrated framework. So this opens entirely new possibilities for cybernetics, and I think we're seeing a resurgence of what we can call third wave cybernetics. For example, the Australian National University wanted to establish a multidisciplinary school, not just a department, an entire school, and they chose to name that new entity the School of Cybernetics. It's radically multidisciplinary. It includes environmentalists, computer specialists, biologists, activists, and so on. And so we begin to see how the events that we've been tracing allow a fusion between the idea of human machine feedback and human environmental feedback extended to the entire biological biosphere, all come together in an integrated framework. And that's what's energizing something like the School of Cybernetics at Australian National University. And I anticipate that this is going to reinvigorate an interest in cybernetics. The fusion of cybernetics with environmental concerns offers potent new possibilities for intervention, for research, for analysis, and I think this idea is going to spread very quickly. So this is what I call detoxifying cybernetics through redefining and refocusing it. So we went from anti-aircraft designs of the kind Wiener was working on to environmental problems and solutions. We went from symbiosis between organisms, which Margulis was emphasizing, to techno-symbiosis between humans, non-humans, and computational media. So with that, I'll conclude my lecture. Thank you for your attention. And here's my website and also my email. I welcome any comments or responses you have to this talk. Feel free to email me. I'd be delighted to hear from you. Thank you.